The wind was cold that night, and the farm lay quiet under a dark sky, lit only by a thin moon above the fields and trees, and the small wooden house, where John and Sarah lived, stood like a lone guard in the wide, open land far from any town or road, and in the deep silence a strange light suddenly tore across the horizon like a scar of fire that split the darkness in two, and the ground seemed to tremble as if something heavy had fallen from the sky. John was a man who had seen many storms and wars in his life, yet this light was different, and it made his heart beat faster as he stepped out onto the porch with a lantern in his hand, and Sarah came behind him, her face pale in the glow of the lamp as she asked what it was. But before he could answer, another flash came brighter this time, and the sound followed like a deep roar from under the earth, and then the wind carried a smell of burned metal, and something sharp that made their eyes sting. They looked toward the forest that grew thick at the edge of the farmland, and there between the trees a faint glow moved low to the ground like a fire struggling to live, and then it went out, leaving only shadows and silence again. But in that silence there was a sound soft and thin like a small voice crying, and Sarah gripped John's arm and said, "Someone is out there," and they both began to walk toward the sound, their boots sinking into the wet grass. The forest was dark and heavy with mist, and each step seemed to take them deeper into a place that did not belong to the farm or the world they knew, and the crying sound grew clearer, now mixed with a strange tone like metal touching glass. And then they saw her, a small figure crouched at the base of a fallen tree, her skin pale blue that caught the lantern light in a soft shimmer, her clothes torn and burned, her hair short and dark, and her eyes wide and glowing faintly, like two pieces of a lost star, and in her hands she clutched a strange piece of metal shaped like a broken blade. She looked at them but did not speak, and her breath came fast and rough, and there were thin lines across her arms like marks from ropes or claws, and behind her in the mist something moved with a low growl, and John stepped forward, quickly putting himself between her and the sound, while Sarah knelt beside the small figure and spoke gently, though she knew the girl might not understand, and the girl's gaze shifted between them, as if weighing whether they were friend or enemy. The growl came again, closer now, and the shape in the dark was big and heavy with steps that cracked branches underfoot, and John felt the old soldier in him wake up, his hand tightening on the lantern pole like a weapon, and he said to Sarah, "Take her and go." And Sarah took the girl's small cold hand and tried to pull her up, but she was weak and staggered, and the piece of metal in her hand clinked against the ground as she rose. The shape in the mist stepped into the light just enough for them to see, tall and armored with eyes like red coals and a mouth that opened wider than any humans could, and it moved fast toward them, and John swung the lantern hard, smashing it against the thing's face, and the flame burst across its armor, making it reel back with a hiss, and Sarah pulled the girl in her arms and ran toward the edge of the trees, calling for John to follow. They broke out of the forest into the open field, the cold air hitting them hard, and John ran behind them, glancing back to see the shape still burning as it thrashed among the trees, but he knew it would not stay down for long. And they reached the porch, and Sarah rushed inside, placing the girl on the couch by the fire that still glowed from earlier in the evening, and John slammed the door shut and pushed the heavy table against it while listening for any sound outside. The girl sat very still, her glowing eyes scanning the room in a way no child should, her small hands gripping the broken metal piece, like it was the only thing keeping her alive. And Sarah tried to offer her water, but she did not drink. Instead, she pointed toward the door and spoke in a soft voice, made a sound they had never heard before, and she repeated one word again and again until her voice shook and her hands trembled, and John felt the hair on the back of his neck rise. Outside, the wind had died, yet the air felt heavy, as if something waited just beyond the walls, and then a shadow passed across the one window that faced the field, and John moved quietly to the corner, rifle in hand, ready for whatever might follow, but no one came, and after a long moment, the only sound was the crack of the fire and the slow breathing of the girl on the couch. Sarah brought a blanket and wrapped it around her, and though she still shivered, the girl's eyes never closed, and every now and then she glanced toward the window or the door as if she expected them to burst open at any second, and John could not shake the feeling that she was not afraid for herself alone, but for them too, and he wondered who or what she had been running from when she fell from the sky into their quiet farm life. The night passed slowly with no more strange lights or growls, but neither John nor Sarah slept, and the girl did not move from the couch until the first pale light of morning touched the windows, and when the sun rose over the fields, it seemed to chase away the weight that had hung over the house. And yet the three of them knew something had changed forever, for she had come from somewhere far beyond their world, and whoever or whatever had followed her into that forest would not forget where she had gone. And so on that cold night, when the wind blew hard across the land and the stars watched silently from above, John and Sarah had made a choice without knowing the cost. They had opened their home to a stranger from another world, and in doing so they had taken the first step toward a future none of them could yet see, one where that small blue-skinned orphan would grow to be more than they could ever imagine, and one where the shadow that had hunted her would return again someday in greater strength, in greater fury. The sun had risen high and poured light through the windows of the small farmhouse, and the girl sat quietly on the couch, still wrapped in the blanket. Sarah had given her eyes wide and unblinking as they followed every movement in the room, and she held that strange shard of metal tight against her chest, as though it was a part of her body and could never be taken away. And John stood near the kitchen table, sipping from a mug of coffee, while his eyes never left her. He wondered what kind of child could sit so still without fear or fidgeting, and he saw that even in her calmness her hands twitched sometimes like she was ready to spring into action. And Sarah came from the kitchen with a plate of bread and fruit and placed it in front of her, but the girl only stared at it for a moment, then reached forward, slowly sniffed the bread, and touched it with her fingers before tasting the smallest piece and chewing like someone who had not eaten in days, but also like someone who was not sure if the food was safe. Sarah spoke softly, telling her it was good food and safe to eat, and the girl glanced at Sarah's face as though studying the tone of her voice and the shape of her lips, and then nodded slightly before taking another bite. And John noticed that she chewed fast, but swallowed slowly and drank water in small sips, as if every drop was precious, and he felt a pang in his chest thinking of the life she must have lived before arriving here. Days passed, and the girl remained silent, though she began to follow Sarah around the house, watching everything she did from washing dishes to hanging clothes outside. And Sarah began pointing to things and saying their names slowly and clearly, hoping the girl would repeat them. And at first she only listened, her glowing eyes fixed on Sarah's mouth. But then one evening, while they were sitting by the fire, she pointed to a cup on the table and spoke one word, her voice soft and careful, and Sarah smiled and said, "Yes, cup," and repeated it until the girl whispered it again. John saw how quickly she learned, and he began showing her other things, tools in the shed, parts of the old truck, and names of animals in the yard. And she would nod once, as if locking the word in her mind, and later he would hear her whispering those words to herself like a soldier reciting orders before a mission. And he realized she was not just learning to speak, she was studying everything about them, their home, their habits, their way of life. But sometimes at night her calm would break, and they would hear her cry out in her sleep words in a language they did not know, filled with pain and fear and sometimes anger, and John would sit by her side until her breathing slowed again, though she never woke fully, and in the morning she would be silent again, but her eyes would be tired and far away. And it was in those moments that John saw a shadow of the person she had been before she came here, a shadow of battles and loss. One afternoon, while John was mending a fence, he heard a sharp whistle from the house and saw the girl standing on the porch, pointing toward the far edge of the field, her eyes narrowed and alert, and he followed her gaze to see a dark shape moving low in the tall grass. And when he raised his rifle, the shape darted away too fast to be an animal and vanished into the woods. And when he turned back, the girl was still pointing her hand steady, her face serious. And without a word, she mimed holding a weapon, then pointed again to the grass. John knew then that she had seen things no child should see and had skills no child should have, and he began to test her, gently tossing a ball toward her, without warning, only to watch her catch it easily, or dropping a stick from behind his back, only for her to grab it before it hit the ground. And when he tossed two at once, she caught both without looking, and he felt the truth settling deeper in his mind. She had been trained long before she met them, trained for something dangerous. Sarah noticed changes, too. The girl moved without sound across the wooden floors, her feet light and careful. She seemed to know the layout of the house after only a few days and could find anything in the kitchen without asking. She ate more now, and her body grew stronger, her movements faster and more sure. And sometimes Sarah would catch her standing at a window, scanning the fields like a watchman, waiting for an enemy she could not yet see. Weeks turned into months, and words turned into sentences, and the girl began to tell them small things about her world, how the air there was thicker, and the night sky glowed with rivers of light, how her people could see farther in the dark than humans, and how they could move quicker than most other beings. And John listened closely to every detail, knowing that even these simple facts painted a picture of a life far beyond Earth. One cold evening, the girl, now wearing clothes Sarah had sewn from old fabric, sat at the table with them, and John asked her name, and she hesitated, then placed her small hand on the shard of metal she still carried, and said Lyra, her voice steady, as if daring them to forget it, and John repeated it, and Sarah did too, and the girl nodded once, and for the first time she smiled, though it was small and fleeting like a star behind clouds. After that night, Lyra spoke more and more, but she never said where her family was or what had happened to them. She avoided questions about the growling creature in the forest and about the strange ships in the sky that had brought her here, and John chose not to press her, knowing that when she was ready she would tell them. But he also knew that the world she came from was not done with her, and sooner or later would reach into their quiet life again. Her bond with Sarah grew. Quickly, Sarah taught her to read and write simple words, and soon Lyra could write her own name in neat, careful letters. She helped in the garden and learned to cook small meals. She fed the animals and even managed to calm the old sheepdog that barked at everyone except John and Sarah. And yet there was always that edge to her, always the feeling that she was never fully at rest. John began to teach her simple exercises to build her strength, running short distances, lifting small weights, climbing the trees at the edge of the field, and Lyra took to it with quiet determination, never complaining, never stopping until John told her to. And he saw in her the discipline of a soldier, though she was still so young. And one day, when he showed her how to hold a wooden stick like a rifle, she moved into position instantly, as if her body already knew the shape of the stance. And in that moment, he realized she had been a fighter long before she learned to be a child. The peace they had was fragile, and both John and Sarah felt it, though they never spoke of it openly, for every time the wind carried a strange sound from the forest, Lyra would freeze her head, turning her eyes, narrowing, and her hand going to the shard of metal at her side. And in those moments, John knew she was not afraid of what might come. She was waiting for it. And so life continued in the small farmhouse, with days of quiet work and nights by the fire, and a growing sense that the calm was only a pause between storm. For though Lyra learned to live like a human child, she had not forgotten who she was, and whatever had chased her across the stars had not forgotten either. And somewhere beyond the sky, the game between them had only just begun. The air was sharp that night, with a thin frost forming on the edges of the barn roof, and the moon hung low and heavy, as if watching over the sleeping fields. And inside the farmhouse, Sarah sat by the fire, mending a shirt, while John cleaned his old rifle on the kitchen table, and Lyra sat on the floor beside the hearth, carving small lines into a piece of wood with a steady hand, her glowing eyes reflecting the orange light of the flames. And all was quiet except for the soft crack of burning logs. Then it came a sound, faint at first, like the hum of distant engines far above the clouds, and Lyra froze her head, tilting slightly, her hand stopping mid-movement. And John looked up at her, then followed her gaze toward the window, and the hum grew louder, turning into a deep pulsing thrum that rattled the glass and made the old dishes in the cupboard tremble. And Sarah set down her work, her eyes wide, as she whispered, "John, is that them?" Before he could answer, the night outside split open, with streaks of silver light racing across the sky like knives cutting through darkness, and the ground shook with a low vibration that seemed to crawl up through their feet into their bones. And Lyra stood in one smooth motion, her small fingers tightening around the strange shard she always carried. And she said one word in her own language, a word sharp and short like the crack of a whip, and John knew it was a warning. A blast of wind slammed against the house as something large passed overhead, and a shadow covered the moon for a heartbeat before moving on, and then a bright flare lit the edge of the field, revealing shapes dropping from the sky, fast and silent at first, then landing with heavy thuds that shook the earth. And from the light, John saw them, tall figures wrapped in dark armor, with long limbs and glowing red eyes, and they moved toward the farmhouse with slow, sure steps, like predators that knew the kill could not escape. John grabbed his rifle and checked the chamber while Sarah moved to the back room, pulling out the small box of ammunition, and Lyra slipped to the window, scanning the yard, her breath slow and steady, her body still like a hunter before the strike. And then one of the armored figures stepped into the open, raising a weapon that seemed to growl with energy, and aimed it at the house. And John fired first, the shot cracking the night and hitting the thing in the chest. But instead of falling, it only staggered before letting out a screech that made the glass shake. More shapes moved in the field, now spreading out to encircle the house, their eyes burning brighter as they came, and Lyra turned from the window and ran to the front door, not to hide, but to go out, and John caught her by the arm. But she looked at him with a fierce gaze that told him she was not a child in this moment. She was something else entirely, and before he could speak, she slipped free and was out into the yard, moving low and fast like the wind itself. One of the creatures turned toward her, its weapon rising, but she was already there, sliding under its reach and striking the back of its legs with the shard of metal in her hands, and the armor split with a sharp sound, and the thing collapsed with a howl, and Lyra rolled to her feet, firing the strange core with a flash of blue light that cut through its helmet and silenced it forever, and John could only watch for a second before another figure came at him from the side, and he fired again, this time hitting true as it fell into the dirt. The air was filled now with the roar of engines above, the pounding of feet on frozen ground, and the high scream of alien weapons firing green bolts that hissed through the cold night and burned black holes into the walls of the barn. And Sarah crouched behind the porch railing, loading John's rifle when she could and tossing it back to him as Lyra darted between attackers, never staying in one place long enough to be hit, her movements sharp and perfect like a dance she had practiced her whole life. One of the armored soldiers raised a long staff glowing at both ends and swung it toward her, but she caught it between her arms, twisted, and snapped it in two before driving the broken piece through the gap in its armor and pulling it free in a single motion. And John felt a cold realization settling in. This was no lucky child fighting out of fear. This was a trained warrior, even if her body was still small and slight, and the way she fought spoke of battles far worse than this night. The leader appeared, then stepping out from the line of attackers, taller than the rest, with armor marked in deep crimson and a helmet shaped like a blade, and its voice rang out across the field in a language none of them knew, but Lyra did, and she stopped her movement, her head tilting as if to listen to every word, and her grip on the shard tightened until her knuckles went pale, and she answered in the same language, her tone sharp and unyielding, and the leader froze for a moment before letting out a slow, deep growl. In the next breath, it raised its weapon and fired a shot aimed directly at her heart, but Lyra moved before the light could reach her, flipping backward into the cover of a fallen enemy and returning fire with the shard's core, and the blast hit the leader in the side of the helmet, tearing it open just enough for John to see a face pale and twisted with fury, and before it pulled back into the shadows, it spoke one final word loud enough for even John and Sarah to hear, a word that hissed like venom. Vorlith. The remaining attackers began to retreat, moving back toward the far edge of the field, their eyes still burning, but their steps faster now, as if the loss of their leader's presence had broken some hold over them, and soon the only sound was the wind again whispering through the grass, and the faint hum of the strange shard cooling in Lyra's hands, and she stood there in the moonlight, her chest rising and falling, her face unreadable as she watched the darkness where they had gone. John stepped toward her, but she did not move, her gaze fixed far beyond the field as if she could still see them, and Sarah came out to stand beside him, her hand on his arm, and for a long time none of them spoke, and then Lyra turned to them, and in her new-learned human words said quietly, "They have found me," and her voice held no fear, only a certainty that sent a cold shiver down John's spine, because he knew this was not the end, this was only the beginning, and whatever had started tonight would return with greater strength. The house was quiet except for the faint creak of the old wood as the wind pressed against the walls, and outside the fields lay cold and empty, though John kept looking out the window, as if the shapes from the night before might return at any moment, and Sarah sat at the table, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea that had long gone cold, her eyes fixed on the girl who now sat across from them, with the strange shard of metal resting on the table between them, its faint blue light pulsing softly in the dim room. Lyra's gaze moved between them, and then down to the shard as if she was deciding how much to say, and John leaned forward, his voice low, as he asked her again what those things were and why they had come, and for a long moment she said nothing, only ran her fingers along the sharp edge of the shard. Then she looked up, her glowing eyes catching the light, and she spoke slowly in the careful human words she had learned, saying, "They are Vorlith, and they want me dead before I become strong enough to destroy them." Sarah felt the air in the room grow heavier at those words, and John's jaw tightened as he asked why they feared her so much, and Lyra's eyes turned distant, as if she was seeing another place, another time, and she began to tell them about the world. She came from a world with skies of deep violet and rivers of light that flowed through mountains of crystal, a world where her people lived not just on the ground, but in the air, their cities floating on great platforms of metal and stone, and her people were warriors trained from birth to defend their home against any who would threaten it. She spoke of the Vorlith, a race of conquerors who came from the edge of known space, their ships black as shadow, and their weapons burning with green fire. They attacked without warning, tearing through her people's defenses with brutal speed, and she had been only a child when the first wave came, but she remembered the screams, the heat, the way the sky seemed to fall apart around her, and her people fought back with everything they had, yet the Vorlith were too many and too relentless. John listened in silence as Lyra's voice grew quieter, and she told them that her parents had been among the highest commanders in the defense, and when the final city fell, her father had given her the shard, the core of a weapon that only their kind could wield, and he had told her to run, to survive, to carry the core far away, because if the Vorlith got it, they would use it to crush the last free worlds, and she had run through fire and smoke, hiding among the wreckage until a ship loyal to her people had taken her and fled into the void, but the Vorlith had followed. The ship had not made it far before it was hit, and she had been thrown into an escape pod. Her last memory of her world was the sight of that great ship breaking apart in flames as her pod was hurled toward the darkness between stars, and then toward the small blue planet that would become her new home. And when she had crawled from the wreck in the forest, she had still heard them in the distance, the Vorlith hunting her even there. Sarah reached across the table and took Lyra's small hand in hers, feeling the tremble beneath her skin, and she told her gently that she was safe here, but Lyra shook her head slowly and said, "No, they will come again. They always come again." And she looked at John then, with a steady gaze, and told him the shard was not just a weapon, it was a key, a core that could power the strongest battle armor her people had ever built, armor that could turn one fighter into an army, and that was why the Vorlith would never stop hunting her. John leaned back in his chair, the weight of her words settling into him like a stone, and he asked her why she had fought the way she had last night, where she had learned to move like that, and she told him that even as a child she had been trained every day. Her people believed that every life was part of the defense of their home, and that even the smallest among them could learn to strike true, to survive, to protect, and though she had been the youngest in her training circle, she had been one of the fastest, one of the most precise. Sarah's eyes softened as she asked if there were others like her out there, survivors of her people, but Lyra looked down at the shard and after a moment whispered, "No, not anymore. I am the last," and her voice held no tears, only a deep, steady sadness that made the room feel colder, and John realized then that the girl sitting across from him was carrying the weight of an entire world on her small shoulders, and she had been carrying it alone until now. He stood and walked to the window, scanning the empty fields. And then he turned back to her and said, "If they come again, we will be ready. You are not alone anymore." And Lyra's eyes met his, and for a moment the faintest light of hope seemed to flicker there, though it was gone as quickly as it came, replaced by the steel of someone who knew the enemy would return, and when they did, it would not be with a handful of soldiers, but with an army. That night John cleared space in the old barn, bringing out equipment he had not touched in years, boxes of gear from his days as a soldier, training dummies, weights, ropes, and old targets. And in the morning he took Lyra there and told her they would train together. She did not smile. She simply nodded and began without hesitation, her small body moving with precision as she ran drills, climbed ropes, lifted what she could, and practiced with the wooden rifle he had given her. And as the days passed, her speed grew, her aim sharpened, and her movements became even more dangerous. Sarah watched them sometimes from the doorway, her heart torn between pride and fear, for the child who had come to them lost and broken was becoming something else, something stronger and far more dangerous. Yet she could not ignore the truth that Lyra would need every skill, every bit of strength for what was coming, because the Vorlith would not stop, and when they returned they would bring the full force of their war. One evening after training, Lyra stood at the edge of the field watching the sun sink below the horizon, her shard glowing faintly in her hand, and John came to stand beside her asking what she was thinking, and she said quietly that the Vorlith believed they had ended her people, but they had not, and as long as she lived the fight was not over, and when they came again, she would not run, she would not hide, she would make them pay for every life they had taken. And John believed her, because in her voice there was no fear, only the certainty of someone who had already decided her path. And so the truth about Lyra had been spoken, and the quiet life they had known before was gone, replaced by the shadow of a war that had started light years away, but had now come to their doorstep. And though they did not yet know when or how the next strike would come, they knew it was only a matter of time, and this time, when it came, Lyra would be ready. The transport ship moved through the silent darkness of space, carrying Arya and her human squad toward the Outer Rim colonies. Their mission was not yet fully revealed to her, but the tense looks on the faces of the soldiers told her enough. Something dangerous waited ahead, something that even hardened fighters were not eager to face. She sat near the viewport staring at the distant stars, remembering her training, the endless drills, the late nights in the barracks when her human brothers and sisters whispered stories of battles past. She had listened closely, learning not only the tactics of war, but the small, unspoken truths, that courage was often born in fear and loyalty in shared danger. The sergeant's voice cut through her thoughts. He ordered the team to gather in the central hold. The mission briefing was about to start. The holographic map lit the chamber, showing a cluster of colonies under threat. The enemy was not a nameless pirate gang or a single warlord. It was something much worse, a coalition of alien clans known for raiding human settlements. Their cruelty had no limit. They took prisoners only to display them as trophies. Arya felt a fire burn inside her chest. The idea of innocent families being hunted like prey stirred memories she thought she had buried. The commander pointed at a small red mark. On the map, this was the colony of Haven Reach, the first target in the enemy's path. The mission was to defend it at all costs. The team would drop in before dawn, set up defenses, and hold until reinforcements arrived. But there was a catch. The reinforcements were 2 days away. If the enemy attacked in full strength, they would be on their own. The soldiers nodded with grim acceptance. They had faced long odds before, yet this time the enemy's speed and numbers made survival uncertain. Arya looked around at her squad. She saw resolve in their eyes, the same resolve she carried since the day humans had taken her in. The sergeant ended the briefing with a single sentence. Hold the line, or there will be nothing left to save, as they strapped their gear and prepared for descent. Arya tightened the harness on her armor. Every piece felt like a part of her own body, forged by the years of training and the countless battles she had fought alongside these people she now called her family. When the dropship broke through Haven Reach's thin atmosphere, the sky glowed with the pale light of a distant sun. The colony was small, rows of metal structures huddled together against the wind. Beyond them lay vast stretches of red rock plains, the horizon broken by jagged mountains. Arya's boots hit the ground and dust swirled around her legs. The air smelled faintly of iron and ash. She scanned the perimeter, noting every weak point, every approach path, and every place an enemy sniper might hide. The colonists watched from a distance, their faces pale with worry. Children clung to their parents. Sensing the fear that adults tried to hide, Arya gave them a small nod, a silent promise that they were not alone. The squad split into teams. Some set up barricades using metal crates and reinforced plating. Others ran power cables to automated turrets. Arya joined the frontline team, laying down motion sensors and mines along the main approach. Every second mattered. The sun dipped lower and the shadows grew long. The sergeant moved between positions, checking their readiness, his voice calm but urgent. Arya kept working, her sharp eyes scanning the ridges in the distance. She knew that somewhere out there, the enemy was watching, waiting for night to fall. As darkness swallowed the colony, the first sign of the enemy came not as a sound, but as a flicker of movement on the far ridge. Then another, then dozens, shapes slipping through the dim light. The motion sensors chimed softly, each ping a heartbeat in the growing silence. The squad took positions behind the barricades, weapons ready. The commander gave no speech, only a quiet order to hold fire until the enemy crossed the outer mines. Arya's breathing slowed, her fingers tightening around her rifle grip. The world narrowed to the small slice of land in front of her, the place where the first wave would break. A flash of light erupted on the ridge as the enemy opened fire. Plasma bolts tore through the air, striking the barricades with sizzling heat. The mines detonated one by one, sending up showers of dirt and alien bodies. The squad returned fire, the night lit by bursts of energy and tracer rounds. Arya moved with precision, each shot hitting its mark, dropping enemies before they could close the distance. The air was thick with the smell of ozone and burning metal. Still the enemy pressed forward, their war cries echoing across the plains, louder with each charge. The colonists huddled in the shelters, listening to the chaos outside. The walls trembled with each explosion, but Arya and her squad held their ground. The barricades buckled under the relentless assault, and soon the fight spilled into the narrow streets of the colony. Arya switched to her blade, moving like a shadow between buildings, cutting down any who slipped past the defenses, her speed and strength unmatched. The enemy began to falter, their advance slowed by the ferocity of the defenders, yet the battle was far from over. Hours passed like moments, and when the enemy finally pulled back, the red light of dawn was spilling over the horizon. The ground was littered with bodies and scorched debris. Arya stood at the edge of the barricades, her armor scorched, her breath ragged, but her eyes steady. The squad had survived the night. Haven Reach still stood. The commander gave a brief nod of approval, but his voice was heavy with warning. This was only the first wave. The enemy would return, and next time they would come in greater numbers. Arya knew he was right. The fight had only begun. The galaxy was wide, and danger waited in every shadow. But she also knew something else, something the enemy had learned the hard way that night. She was no longer just the orphan they had once saved, no longer the child hiding from her past. She was a weapon honed by human hands, a shield for those who could not fight, and a storm for those who brought war to her door. As the sun rose higher and the colony prepared for what came next, she silently promised that no matter how many waves came, she would stand until the last. The warship moved through the dark space like a silent blade, cutting through the night, and every crew member felt the heavy weight of the mission. They had accepted the enemy fleet was ahead, hidden behind the moon of a dead world, and it was here that the enemy planned to strike the human colonies and crush them in a single blow. And Kayla, the alien child, once lost, now the feared mercenary, stood at the center of the control room, her sharp eyes scanning the star map as her human father captain. Rourke gave the final orders, and his voice was calm, but carried the steel of someone who knew there was no turning back from what was to come. The crew worked fast hands on glowing panels, voices low and tense. The sound of the engines was a deep hum that vibrated through the metal floor, and Kayla could feel it through her boots, a steady beat like the heart of a living beast. She remembered the words her mother once told her before her first mission, that fear was not weakness, it was a sign that you understood the danger, and that courage was moving forward despite it. They reached the shadow of the moon. The enemy fleet was out there, silent, their signals hidden, their weapons ready. Kayla closed her eyes and let her mind stretch into the dark void. The training given to her by both her human family and her years as a mercenary had made her senses razor sharp. She could almost feel the hostile intent from the blackness ahead. It was like a cold wind brushing against her skin. A sudden flash of light cut across the darkness, a scout ship destroyed before it could send a warning, and the tension in the control room broke into action. Orders, shouted, weapons, charged shields, raised the warship, surged forward. Kayla moved to the weapons station, her hand steady as she locked onto the nearest enemy ship. Her breath was slow and controlled. The first wave hit them like a storm. The enemy fighters came fast, swarming like metal insects, lasers slicing through the darkness, explosions blooming in silence. Kayla's ship shook under the impact. Alarms screamed, red lights flashed, but the crew moved like one body, each person trusting the others to do their part. Kayla's turret spun, firing at impossible angles. The enemy ships burst apart under her shots one after another, but there were too many. Every time one fell, two more took its place. And in the middle of the chaos, she saw the enemy flagship, massive and armored, its black hull reflecting the faint light of distant stars. It was the core of their attack. If it fell, the rest of the fleet would scatter. Captain Rourke looked at her. Without speaking, she understood the order. Without words, they had to strike at the heart. Kayla left the turret, moving to the drop bay, where her combat suit waited. It was old, scratched for battles past, but it had never failed her. She climbed in the metal plates locking around her body, the helmet sealing. With a hiss, the suit systems came alive in her vision with soft blue light. The drop bay doors opened, revealing the cold emptiness of space and the burning chaos of the battle. Kayla launched herself out, her suit thrusters igniting as she cut through the void, her path a straight line toward the enemy flagship. Enemy fighters tried to intercept her, but she was faster, her movements sharp and unpredictable each time they aimed. She was already gone, her rifle in hand, firing short bursts that tore through their hulls. The flagship grew larger in her vision, its armor thick and bristling with weapons. She darted under the fire, skimming along the surface until she reached an entry port. She placed a charge on the door and braced herself. The blast sent the metal flying, and she slipped inside. The corridors were narrow, the air thick with the smell of burning circuits. Enemy soldiers appeared, their eyes wide in shock as they saw her. She moved with deadly speed, each step precise, each shot finding its mark. Her heart was steady, her focus absolute. She reached the core chamber, a massive space filled with glowing energy conduits, and at the center the enemy commander, a towering figure with skin like dark stone and eyes like molten fire. He raised his weapon, but Kayla was already moving. She dove to the side, rolled, and came up firing the shots, striking his armor and forcing him back. But he was strong, each step shaking the floor, his strikes fast and heavy. Kayla knew she could not win in a straight fight. She darted around him, using the machinery for cover, firing at weak points in his armor, each shot chipping away, until finally she saw the opening, his chest plate cracked. She aimed and fired, the blast hitting true. He roared in rage and fell, the sound echoing through the chamber. She moved to the core, placed her last charges, and ran. The explosion tore through the flagship from the inside, light flooding the corridors. As she sprinted to the hangar, her suit systems screaming warnings, the ship shook around her. She launched herself out of the hangar just as the flagship erupted behind her, the shockwave throwing her into the dark. But her thrusters caught her. She steadied herself and looked back, the massive ship breaking apart, its pieces scattering into the void. The enemy fleet faltered, without its leader, their formation breaking. Kayla returned to her ship, landing hard in the drop bay. The crew cheered, but the battle was not over. They still had to drive the remaining ships away. She joined the fight, once more, her rifle blazing, her voice steady, as she called out targets to the crew, each kill pushing the enemy further back. Finally, the last enemy ship fled into the dark. The warship floated in the silent aftermath, debris drifting in the void. Kayla removed her helmet, her face calm, but her eyes holding the fire of the battle. She walked to the control room, standing beside her father. The stars stretched before them, endless and cold, but for now, they had won. Captain Rourke placed a hand on her shoulder, and for a moment the noise of the world faded. She was no longer the orphan, no longer the feared mercenary. She was his daughter, and she had defended their people. But deep inside, she knew this was not the end. The enemy would return stronger, and the next fight would be even harder, and she would be ready for it. The battlefield was silent for a moment as smoke rose from the ground like dark ghosts twisting in the cold wind, and the stars above looked down like ancient eyes watching the final moments of a long story that had been written in blood and courage and pain. As she stood there with her weapon still in her hand and her breath heavy in her chest, her eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of the enemy that had chased her across worlds and left her without rest for so many years. She could feel the weight of her journey pressing on her shoulders, but she stood tall because that was what her human parents had taught her: never to bow to fear, never to let the enemy see weakness, and never to give up no matter the cost. And their voices echoed in her mind now, like a shield against the darkness, reminding her that she was not just a soldier, not just a mercenary, but something far more dangerous, a living proof of what humans could create when they chose to protect instead of destroy. Her enemy was still out there, somewhere hiding, waiting, and she knew this would be the last fight between them. There would be no escape, no running away this time. Either she would end him, or he would end her, and the thought brought a strange calm to her heart, because she had already faced death more times than she could count, and had always come back stronger. The wind carried the faint metallic scent of alien blood and the ruins of machines that had been torn apart in the chaos, and she walked forward through the debris, her boots crunching over shattered steel and glass, her mind sharp and clear as she remembered every lesson from her first battle to the last, every moment her human father had stood beside her, showing her how to survive and how to think like a hunter instead of prey, and every smile her human mother had given her to remind her that she was loved even in the middle of war. A shadow moved in the distance, and she froze, every muscle locked, and ready, her weapon rising slowly as her eyes narrowed and her breath became steady, because she knew it was him, the one who had ordered the destruction of her first home, the one who had sworn to erase her from existence, the one who had underestimated the stubborn will of a child raised by humans. He stepped out from the smoke tall and scarred his armor cracked from their last fight, but his eyes still burning with hate, and he spoke in a voice that rumbled through the air like distant thunder, calling her by the name he had given her years ago, a name meant to be an insult, but now one she carried like a badge of honor, because every time he said it she remembered that he had failed to break her. They circled each other slowly, the ground between them littered with the remains of armies that had fallen in this war, and the silence grew heavier until the only sound was the hum of her weapon and the distant groan of broken machines, and in that moment she knew there would be no words, no more speeches, only action. She moved first, her body flowing like a shadow across the battlefield, every step precise, every strike meant to end the fight, and he met her blow for blow, his speed almost matching hers, but she had something he could never match, a will forged in human fire, a heart that refused to break no matter the pain, and every clash of their weapons sent sparks flying like tiny stars into the dark sky. The fight dragged on, each of them pushing the other to the edge, but she could feel the balance slowly tipping in her favor, every move he made becoming just a little slower, every block just a little weaker, and she pressed harder, letting the memory of her parents guide her, the way her father had taught her to spot the smallest openings, and the way her mother had taught her to trust her instincts even when the odds seemed impossible. He tried one last desperate strike, a heavy swing that could have crushed her if it landed, but she stepped inside his guard, her weapon twisting in her hands, and in a single smooth motion she brought it up under his armor, where his defenses were weakest, and the energy blade cut deep the shock in his eyes, telling her that he had finally realized this was the end. He stumbled back, his weapon falling from his hand, and she stepped forward, watching him drop to his knees, the war in his gaze fading into something almost like acceptance as he looked up at her one last time, and then fell forward into the dust. The silence that followed was different now, lighter, somehow, as if the planet itself had been holding its breath, waiting for this moment, and she lowered her weapon, letting the exhaustion wash over her for the first time in years, knowing the fight was finally over. She looked up at the stars again, and for a moment she imagined her human parents there watching her, proud and smiling, and the weight in her chest eased, because she had kept her promise to them. She had survived, she had fought, and she had won, not just for herself, but for every human lesson they had given her, every kindness they had shown. The battlefield was quiet now, but she knew the galaxy would remember this day. They would tell stories about the alien Orphan who had been adopted by humans and who had risen to become the deadliest soldier in the universe, not because of her weapons or her strength, but because of the human spirit burning in her heart. She turned and began to walk away from the ruins, her steps steady, her eyes forward, because she knew there would be other battles someday. But for now she had earned her rest, and she would carry the memory of her parents with her. Wherever she went, a reminder that no matter how far she traveled, she would always be their daughter.